Welcome to Sew with Monty. Today we are going to do a lined pocket with a flap. And this is really a wonderful way to create a pocket, especially if it has a contoured shape like a curve or a point or both. The first thing we have done is cut out all of our pieces. This piece represents the body where the pocket will be sewn onto, and this is the actual front side of the pocket. This is the lining for the pocket. The first thing we've done is taken the interfacing and pressed it to the top side of the pocket. So we have the interfacing here on this side, and then we've cut the lining to go with the pocket here. The next thing we're going to do is sew the pocket and the lining together, noting that we have notches right here and here. So we're going to sew this section, stop, skip over, and sew this section together. This way we have a pocket to turn the pocket inside out. So that's what we'll do there. Now let's talk about the flap. This is the flap. So we've cut two flaps. We've got a lining flap and we've got the top side flap. On the top side flap, I've put the interfacing again to this side of the flap. Now this could be optional depending on the type of fabric you have. You may want your interfacing adhered to the lining of the flap. So it just depends on what type of fabric you're using. In this case it doesn't matter too much because they're equivalent cotton woven fabrics. So we're going to sew all the way around the flap the same way. We're going to leave a little opening here, sew all the way around so we can turn the flap as well. So the next step is let's go to the sewing machine and we'll start our sewing. We're going to start sewing the pocket together. The lining to the upper part of the pocket. We're putting right sides together, and note the lining is shorter, but there's a good reason for that, and you'll see it just in a moment. 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to back stitch right here, leave this open, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and do the same over here. So I'm going to just put my fabric in the machine. I'm using a 2.5 stitch length. I want this because we're working in detail to be a little bit closer together. So I'm using a smaller stitch length than normal. And I'm going to stop right at my pin and back stitch a least bit. Now, when you're doing this where you're skipping an area, just loosen your thread and slide it over. There's no point in cutting and stopping and redoing. It's just more threads you have to trim at the end. So I'm going to go forward a little bit and then back up and then go all the way off the edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you have this, you can trim your threads and you're ready to do some pressing before you go forward with any more sewing on the actual pocket. So I'm trimming all my threads, and what will happen next is take all the pins out. We're going to go to the iron and we're going to press this open and flat like this. So it will be open and flat. And then we're going to turn it at the edge of our interfacing here, and we're going to sew all the way around the pocket. This opening we've left is where we're going to turn the pocket. So we'll take this to the iron and then we'll finish sewing that. In the meantime, I want to show you the flap. It's going to be very similar to how we did the pocket. So we have this opening here, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to sew here, back stitch, skip over, sew here. Now, I'm not doing it all the way around like this because I want my corners very crisp. And the best way to get a crisp corner is to overlap or intersect your seams like this instead of going here and turning. So let me show you how this looks. I'm going to go right here, still using 2.5 for my stitch length. I want it kind of close together so that I can be accurate with my detail. So once I get there, I'm going to back up a little bit, and then I'm going to pull my thread, making sure that it's released, and I'm going to start right there at that pin, and I'm going to go forward a little bit, back up a little bit, and go all the way off like this. Perfect. And then I'm going to trim my threads. Now once I have my thread trimmed, I can take my flap And I can even grade this seam a little bit. So I'm going to take my lining and I'm just going to cut it a little bit smaller, about half the width of my seam allowance, right along through here. So it takes the bulk out. And then I'm going to sew from here all the way around the curve. Now I have notches here to make sure my curve stays on and it doesn't. So what we've done, we've sewn the flap from this edge to the opening, skipped over and sewn the flap from this edge to the opening, backing up on both ends, just like we did the pocket. So there's an opening right here. Second part is we've graded the seam. I've taken the lining and I've trimmed it down to half the width of the seam allowance. Now it's time to finish off our corner. So I'm going to start at the top here and I'm going to sew. And when I get to the seam itself, I'm going to do my back up there. I don't need to back up at the top corner, but I'm going to back up over the seam itself. Now this is where the 2.5 stitch length comes in handy. It helps you get around these curves. Now if you have to adjust your fabric, lift up your foot and adjust it to get that nice and smooth. So sometimes you have to do that. You have to lift it up and adjust it. But the smaller stitch length is going to give you a much nicer shape than if you're trying to go around here at a 3 length. So this is one time when having a smaller stitch length is important. Now when I get to the seam, not the end of the fabric, when I get to the seam, I'm going to go up just above it, back over it, and then come on off. Now, why I do this instead of sewing one continuous line around this corner here is because by doing this, I get a very sharp corner where I may or may not get that if I just sew in one continuous line around. After you do that, you can come back and just trim your corner so that you're just about 1/8 of an inch away from that actual sharp corner of your flap. That's the first trim. Now, there's something else we want to do. We want to come back in here just as we did at the top edge and we want to grade the seam. So we're going to take the lining and we're going to trim it down to about half its length or width. So once we get that about halfway, see, we're taking bulk out of here. And if you had your interfacing on this side, it's okay. Do it the same way. Do it on the lining side. Then right here where these curves are, we want to do little V-notches. Now a V-notch is a little different than just doing a little slash, but see how I'm clipping this? And 3 little V-notches. So I'm going to go in, making sure I stay at least 1/16 of an inch away from my seam. And I'm just going to cut these little V-notches. See, 1, 2, 3, right in the pinnacle of the curve. You can use your notch if you have one to do the first V-notch. If you don't, you just have to see where the tightest part of the curve is and cut there first and then cut 3 more. Now some people will go as far as to trim these off. I'd rather like to leave them because it keeps it from having a bulk inside here. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn this little flap inside out. And you have to kind of work with it. You might have to get a pin or a corner turner and turn your corners. So once you have it turned, you want to start pulling out all your little corners and working all your little flap edges up to the top. So you can kind of see, you just start working it. And as you work it, you can feel where those little V-notches in there are effective because it doesn't have a lot of bulk in there. It's nice and flat. And you just keep working this around, making sure you've got your corners turned. And then the next step is we'll go to the ironing board and we'll press the flap in it and make it pretty and shaped. And we'll press this flat. So let's go to the ironing board. I wanted to show you the turner and how to get your corners nice and sharp. If you take this little tip of this little corner turner and you can kind of gently push in there and get your corner nice and sharp. If you don't have this, you can use a large pin, either way, and or both, to turn your corner so that you get a nice sharp corner there. The other thing you can use the turner for is to straighten out your curves. So if you go in here and you just gently take this turner and you push on your curve like this. I'll try to get my hand out of the way. If you take it and you just push on it, you can straighten out the curve and get it nice and round. See the difference in that and the other side? So if you just take your corner, the sharp end of your corner, and just nudge it out. Don't push too hard. You don't want to poke a hole in it. But if you do that, you can get a nice, clean edge. And then what I like to do, once I have my corners nice and sharp, I pin them to the ironing board. This way the ironing board helps me hold everything down while I finish getting all the other edges clean and neat and pressed properly. And as I work it up, I can put a couple more pins in here. Like that. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and start pressing my flap. And I can always come back and reshape or change if I need to work on it a little bit more. Like right in here, I see a little bump and I want to kind of smooth that out. So you can kind of play with it a little more. Because you've got it pinned to the ironing board, it's a lot easier. You've got both hands free. You don't have one hand holding it and the other hand trying to do all the turning. So I'm liking that. That looks pretty good. I think once I get my stitching on it, it's going to look very nice. See, and this will get caught in our stitching when we stitch it to the top of the pocket and you won't even see it. Now this is the next part. We're going to press this open right here in our pocket. Nice and flat. And then we're going to return to the iron and we're going to sew all the way around through here. Trim these edges and notch and turn the pocket inside out. So let's go back to the sewing machine and we'll finish off. Now we're ready to sew around the outside edge of our pocket. 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm using the 2.5 length so that I can get the detail and keep it in control. Note that I pressed open my opening here to turn the pocket. So I'm going to start at one corner here. I'm going to go down and back stitch over and then come all the way through. I've got pins where my notches are on the critical area of my curve. Now you can pin more than this if you prefer to have more pins. You can do it. So I'm going to go all the way around this edge. Now this was off just a wee bit, but I'm going to leave it. I let it grow out so that I don't have twisting inside my pocket. So if this is the case and one side's slightly longer than the other, just let it be, because you don't want to force it together and then have twisting in the outside of your pocket. Going around the curve nice and slow, and then we're going to come up the other side, and I'm going to back stitch right here at the top again, and pull my threads, and then we're going to trim the same way. I'm going to grade it around through here and then notch my corners. Let me grab my scissors. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this outside edge and I'm going to trim my corners down to a 45-degree angle first. That's the first thing. And then I'm going to take the lining side of my pocket and I'm going to trim it to half the width of my seam allowance all the way around. Once I have this done, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to notch clip my curves just like I did my flap so that they turn very nicely. This makes such a beautiful pocket because you can control the shape with the lining instead of trying to tuck this under. It makes such a beautiful finish. So we're going to come in here and we're going to notch 3 little notches in the curve. Now this is a bigger curve, so I'm going to go for 4 notches. So you have to kind of decide. When you look at your curve, you may, maybe even 5, you want to kind of decide, okay, how many notches do I really need in the curve? So I did 5. Keep them about a 1/2 inch apart. You don't want to over notch. A 1/2 inch is close enough. You don't need to go a quarter or just shred it, because if you cut too many, you end up breaking down the integrity of the curve and then it won't have any shape at all. It'll just kind of mush around. So you don't want to put too many in. 5's probably as many as you'd ever need. See, now it's ready to be turned. So we're going to reach in here and we're going to turn the pocket around. And we're going to do the same thing we did with the flap. We're going to turn it with the little white turner, and then we're going to go to the iron and pin it down and press it so it's nice and beautiful. And then we'll come back and set the pocket and the flap to the body of the garment. In their case, it's just a big square or a big rectangle, because we're just doing a sample. So let me go ahead and press this, and then I'll take you to the next step and we'll sew it to the body of the garment. I have my pocket turned inside out, and now I'm going to take my corner turner and I'm just going to gently press into the corners and get them nice and crisp. Then I'm going to take the sharper edge of this and I'm just going to roll it along my seam to make sure my curve and my side seam is pressed all the way out to the edge. See how nice this works? It kind of helps you get those seams right to the edge of your particular pattern or garment piece. And once you have this, you can go ahead and start the pressing. So I'm going to press it nice and flat, and it starts to take a beautiful shape with just a little bit of pressing. See how nice that makes that pocket by lining it? It's such a great way to do it, and you can get beautiful corners that way. Now, one thing we need to do before we take it and sew it to the body, we need to sew up this little hole here. And you can use a multiple of stitches. I like to do a pick stitch, and what I'm going to do is bury my knot inside here. So I'm going to go back inside here a little bit past where the opening actually is. That way the knot is hidden. And then I'm just going to come along, stay in the fold of the lining part, and just come out and pick the top edge of my fold. So I go in my lining about 1/4 of an inch, and then I just come out and pick that stitch. So this is called a pick stitch. You probably know this, those of you that don't. It's a really good stitch to use. Why I like the pick stitch, when I'm done, you won't even be able to see it. It'll look just like a seam if it's done properly. And just take your time. It's worth a little extra effort. It's only about 2.5 inches long, so it's not going to, be that time consuming. About 1/4 inch, and you just want to pick the top, just barely pick. The more you practice this stitch, the better you get at it. And I think the more you'll like using it, because it really makes a nice finish. You can barely see it. I'm making quite a big pick, so mine's a little bit more noticeable. And then when you get to the end, you can just tie off by making a loop. You probably know this too. You can go through the loop and pull your thread, and I like to do it twice just for good measure. And then what I do, instead of just cutting it here, I'm going to bring my thread inside the fabric and pull it out and cut it very, very close. Now I'm going to squeeze it a little bit, and I'm going to cut the thread really close to my fabric. That way when I push it out, I don't have any extra thread hanging on my stitch. See, it's all buried inside there. So a little handwork there, but well worth it. Now, let's take this, and we're going to take our body piece. Now, if this were a garment, you would have marks where the pocket goes. And you would set it on top of the marks, like that, and pin it down. So we're just going to pretend we have marks, since this is just a sample. And I'm going to pin it, and when I pin this down, I'm putting my pins in so I can pull them out as I sew around, but I also have them in at a 45-degree angle. So we're going to sew around through here like this. The flap will set a 1/2 inch above the pocket like this, and it will be sewn right across here. But we're going to do a little stitch on the flap before we set it down. Now, what's nice about this, once we have this sewn on, you don't have a raw edge here with your flap. It'll be as clean underneath as it is on top. Another little secret about flaps, you always want to make your flap at least a 1/4 inch bigger than your actual pocket, so that it doesn't become narrower than the pocket and the pocket sticks out from under the flap. So see, it's a little bit wider, the flap, than the pocket is. So let's go back to the sewing machine and we'll go ahead and finish sewing this up. So now the first thing I'm going to do is put my edge stitch on my flap. And this is going to do a lot to enhance the shape of it. Now I'm going to go down into the flap a little bit, back up and come forward. That way I don't have little strings hanging off the very edge of my pocket, or my pocket flap. Just getting my corner a little bit square there. So I'm going to go down just a little bit. I'm using a 3-stitch length this time because I want it to look very apparent. I want the top stitch not to be small little stitches, so I have to work slow around through here. And I'm doing about 1/8 of an inch top stitch, trying to keep the edge of my flap to the inside edge of the tine of my foot, so that I keep a nice little 1/8 of an inch. I don't want it too close to the edge, but I want it to be closer than just a 1/4 inch top stitch. And you could use a 1/4 inch. There's nothing wrong with that. You can use just about anything. You can even do a double top stitch if you prefer. But you can see that the stitching, let me get my threads trimmed here, the stitching makes a huge difference in the way the pocket flap looks. See how much nicer the stitching holds it in shape? So we're done with the flap for the moment. We're going to put it aside. Now the next thing is we're going to finish pinning our pocket down. Look how beautiful this pocket looks with that lining in there. Such a difference to put the lining in. Actually, I think I've got my pins in backwards. Let me just flip them around here. I want my pin heads to the outside so I can pull them out as I sew around. So I'm just going to change their position. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start lower, back up, come all the way around, go off, and come back. That way I don't have threads right at the corners of my stitching. So I'm going to take this pin out and I'm going to come down about 1/2 inch from the top edge of my pocket and back up and then come in. That way I don't have strings hanging here either. So I'm just going to get a hold of it, go back, and then come on around. I'm using that little 1/8 of an inch spacing from the edge. So I'm doing the same thing, taking the edge of my pocket and lining it up just inside the tine of my foot. Now I'm using a 3-stitch length so it looks nice and pretty, like a pretty top stitch. So I have to go slow in these corners. And then I'm going to lift up the foot, get my pin out of the way, put the foot back down, and just go nice and smooth around through here. Going slow. You can go slow in here. If you need to set your regulator, go slow. You don't have to go fast. See, I can make it so I can't go any speed at all. That's a little too slow for me. I have to go a little faster than that. So when you get to the corner, just let up your speed. And again, if you have trouble doing that with the foot, you can slide your speed regulator back if you have this. Most newer machines do have a speed regulator now, so if you have trouble with that, doing it with your foot, you can use that to slow yourself down in areas where it's critical. Now I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to come up to the edge and then I'm going to come back. I'm going to go all the way to the edge, and if I need to adjust the needle, I'm going to. And then I'm going to push the back up foot for about 1/2 inch. Now, in previous videos I've showed you how to do the small triangle finish on a pocket. I usually reserve that for pockets that don't have flaps where they show. On this one it's not really necessary because the flap's going to cover that area. But if you like that method, it's always nice. It's a nice method to use where you go, start here, go up, around, and back down. So now it's time to place our flap. So we want to make sure, and I'm going to try to get it about 1/2 inch to 3/8 above my pocket. So I'm going to go ahead and pin it, and then I'm going to take a look at it to make sure it's not crooked. So I'm going to pin this side, and then I'm going to pin over here, and then I want to just raise it up and make sure that I'm the same on both sides. So let's see, we're here, and we're here. So I'll take another look at it here, a little low on this side. So I want to put it, now if you need to, and you need to go back to your table to do this, by all means, don't try to do this in front of your sewing machine if you need to go back to your table or your ironing board to do it. Still a little low on this side. So I'm going to come up just a wee bit more and compare them out. I'm going to do it this way this time. Yeah, see now they're perfectly even. The distance from the pocket is good. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to come in, go back, go all the way to the end, and come back to sew the pocket on. The same stitch width from the edge of the fabric. So I'm going to come in just a little bit, about 1/2 inch, and I'm going to get it secure, and then I'm going to back up all the way through my flap. Now why I don't sew this flap exactly right on top of the pocket, A, I can't get into the pocket, and B, I could take a chance of actually catching the top edge of my pocket and sewing it shut. So make sure you keep your flap approximately a ½ inch above your pocket so that you don't end up with it so close that you can't get your hand in it, or you sew the pocket to the flap. Now I'm going to go right in here and I'm going to back up a ½ inch again and trim my strings. And there you have it. Oh, let me trim these strings. And I'll show you a lovely pocket. So there you have it. There's a beautiful pocket. And you could use this method on jackets, shirts, pants, back hip pockets on pants are beautiful. But see, it's all done. And it looks beautiful because it's lined. That's it. Lined pocket with a flap.